All right, let's jump right into this. Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating and frankly highly specific piece of eschatological literature. It's an explainer on a text called the 2033 Convergence, which lays out a deeply mathematical and chronological theory about biblical prophecy. Now, whether you're a total veteran when it comes to theological timelines or you're completely new to this kind of biblical arithmetic, our goal today is just to objectively break down the structure of this argument. We're going to look at exactly how the source text builds its case, step by step and date by date. Honestly, it's a masterclass in how ancient texts are interpreted through the lens of our modern calendar. So let's get into it.
To help us keep track of all this, here's a quick roadmap of what we're covering. We'll start with the biblical pattern hypothesis, move into calculating the 2026 start, break down the tribulation timeline math, look at the 2033 convergence, and finally, wrap up with the third-day prophecy.
Okay, starting things off with Section 1, the biblical pattern hypothesis.
To really grasp what this text is saying, you have to understand its core premise, which is basically that divine plans aren't random. They're revealed through recurring historical patterns. The source applies this specifically to the life of Jesus, pointing out that his first coming wasn't just a single moment. It was a twofold event. You had this quiet, private arrival in a manger, right? And then, years later, a very loud, very public arrival riding into Jerusalem. The text takes this private then public dichotomy and uses it as the exact blueprint for what they hypothesize the second coming is going to look like.
Following that exact same logic, the source hypothesizes that the second coming will perfectly mirror the first. They propose it starts with a quiet, private event, what's often called snatching away or rapture, followed years later by this glorious, incredibly public return that the whole world witnesses. By setting up this two-part pattern, the text kind of builds a foundation to do something really ambitious, assigning actual specific dates.
Which brings us to Section 2, calculating the 2026 start.
So having established that the timeline has to begin with this private event, the text turns to the biblical calendar and zeroes in on a very specific date, October 3, 2026. This happens to align with Shemini Atzeret, which is the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the source points out a scholarly belief that Jesus was actually born during this exact feast, literally coming to tabernacle among humanity. Because of that, the theory suggests that the private phase of his return could mathematically and thematically align with this exact same feast in 2026.
But the math doesn't stop there. The source builds a bridge from this initial starting point to the beginning of a much darker period. They introduce what they call a 30-day processing interval. And the logic here makes a certain kind of sense. They argue the world would need time, specifically 30 days, to process a massive, sudden global event like the private return. So if you take that start date of October 3, 2026, and add exactly 30 days to the calendar, it lands you squarely on November 2nd, 2026. According to the text, this date is the official kickoff for the final 7 years, a period most folks know as the tribulation.
All right, moving right along to Section 3, the tribulation timeline math.
So our starting pin is in the map at November 2, 2026. Now the text relies on ancient scriptures to calculate the exact duration of these final 7 years, giving us the number 2,520. It's a massive figure, but it is absolutely central to the author's entire thesis. Pulling from the books of Daniel and Revelation, the source notes that the tribulation is defined as two halves of 1,260 days each. You add those up, and boom, you get exactly 2,520 days.
And this nicely breaks down the total mathematical count the text is working with. You've got that initial 30-day processing interval plus the strictly defined 2,520 days of the tribulation itself. Add them together, and you're looking at a total unbroken chronological block of exactly 2,550 days from the initial feast day to the very end of the theorized timeline. This level of exact precision is crucial to how the text justifies its final conclusions.
And that takes us to Section 4, the 2033 convergence.
Now you might be wondering, where does all this arithmetic actually lead us in the real world? Let's follow the timeline. We start with the 8th day of Tabernacles on October 3, 2026. We add that 30-day interval to get to November 2nd, the start of the tribulation. Now if we take that November 2nd date and add exactly 2,520 days, we land precisely on September 26, 2033. The source really hammers home this exactness. Those 2,550 total days flawlessly bridge the gap between two highly specific dates on the calendar.
So what's the big deal about September 26, 2033? Well, the source is super quick to point out that on the biblical calendar, this date is Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. And in biblical symbolism, trumpets are almost always used to announce the arrival of royalty. Because of that, the text posits that this specific date, mathematically derived all the way from their 2026 starting point, acts as the definitive, undeniable signal for the glorious, highly public return of the king. It brings the whole thing full circle, perfectly completing that two-part pattern we talked about at the start.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the Third Day Prophecy. But we have to ask, why 2033? Like, is it just a lucky mathematical coincidence based on a guess about 2026? Or is there a deeper reason the text is aiming for this specific year? To actually validate 2033 as an endpoint, the author has to look backward to a firm historical anchor, and the text relies on the broad consensus among historians and biblical scholars that AD 33 was the actual historical year of the crucifixion and resurrection. By dropping anchor at AD 33, the author sets up a massive chronological countdown.
The theological justification for this countdown comes straight from the prophet Hosea. The text quotes this specific line, "After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up." This single verse is literally the linchpin for the source's entire long-term timeline. But to understand how a few days can stretch across thousands of years, we have to look at how the text defines a prophetic day.
The text converts Hosea's 2 days into a literal human timescale by using another classic biblical metric, the idea that, with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years. By defining a prophetic day as exactly 1,000 Earth years, the author effectively scales up Hosea's timeline. So 2 prophetic days translates to 2,000 human years.
Which brings us to our final, arguably most crucial number, 2,000. The source argues that if the resurrection happened in AD 33 and you add exactly 2,000 years, or 2 prophetic days, you land right on the year 2033. According to the text, this means humanity is currently sitting right on the cusp of the third day. The author's position is that the public second coming is basically destined to happen exactly at that 2,000-year milestone in 2033. And therefore, working backward, the preceding 7-year sequence absolutely has to kick off in 2026. So, let's quickly pull all this together and recap how this intricate theory actually interlocks. It ticks off with the hypothesis that divine plans follow distinct, 2-part patterns. From there, it proposes an October 2026 start for a private event, tacks on a 30-day processing interval, and then drops in a strict 2,520-day countdown. That exact arithmetic lands you squarely on September 26, 2033, a date that not only aligns with the Feast of Trumpets, but perfectly hits the 2,000-year milestone from the historical AD 33 anchor, fulfilling the third day prophecy. The text weaves all these dates, days, and prophecies together to construct this highly unified closed-loop model.
At the very end of the source text, the author makes this really passionate appeal to the reader, asking if they're personally ready for this impending timeline. But taking a step back and looking at it objectively, just analyzing the sheer detail and architecture of this 2033 convergence, it really leaves us with a fascinating thought. We have to ask ourselves, how does this kind of meticulously mapped mathematical calculation impact our broader human desire to understand the timeline of eternity? Whether you view a theory like this as a genuine divine revelation or just a really fascinating exercise in ancient textual arithmetic, it perfectly illustrates humanity's enduring, totally insatiable curiosity to decode the unknown, to find patterns in the chaos, and to seek out eternal meaning in the numbers that define our days. What do you think it is about us that makes us want to map out eternity? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it's given you a clear window into how these complex chronological theories are actually constructed.